Listen. In the dead of night, when the clock strikes midnight and the world falls silent, there is a sound that echoes through the corridors of one of America's strangest houses. It is the sound of rain pattering against 100 different rooftops, cascading down chimneys that led nowhere, drumming against windows that open into walls. But those who have walked these halls after dark will tell you something unsettling. They will lean in close and whisper that sometimes, when they listened carefully to that rhythmic tapping in the darkness, they realized something impossible. It was not raining outside at all. Welcome to the Winchester Mystery House, a monument to madness, guilt, and perhaps something far stranger. Here, in San Jose, California, stands a mansion that defies logic itself. A house with doors that open onto brick walls, staircases that climb confidently upward only to end abruptly at the ceiling, hallways that twist back upon themselves in impossible geometries, windows built into floors, chimneys that rise majestically through multiple stories but stop short, never breaking through the roof, a door on the second floor that, if opened, sends you plummeting to the gardens below with nothing but air beneath your feet. For 38 years, construction never stopped. Not for holidays, not for earthquakes, not for the turn of a century. Every single day, the sound of hammers and saws filled the air. Carpenters worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, building and rebuilding, tearing down what was finished yesterday to start again today. Room after room, hallway after hallway, addition after addition. The house grew like a living thing, spreading in every direction, without plan or reason, until it became a labyrinth of 7 stories, containing more than 160 rooms. And at the center of this architectural madness stood one woman, Sarah Winchester, widow, heiress to a vast fortune built on the Winchester rifle. A woman who could not stop building. What drives a human being to such extremes? What kind of terror grips the soul so tightly that the only answer is to build endlessly, desperately, creating confusion in wood and nails? Some say Sarah Winchester was haunted, and perhaps she was, but not by metaphor, not by mere memory. According to those who knew her, Sarah believed she was pursued by something real, something vengeful, something that wanted her dead. The spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles, thousands upon thousands of them, Native Americans who fell on the frontier, soldiers who died in war, victims of crimes, accidents, suicides. Every soul that ever departed this world with a Winchester bullet in their body, Sarah believed, was coming for her, hunting her, and the only way to survive was to confuse them, to create a house so impossibly complex that the ghosts would lose their way in the twisting corridors and never find her bedroom. Never find her. So she built. Every night, she climbed to her séance room, a small chamber at the heart of the mansion with only one entrance but 3 exits, and there she communed with the spirits. They told her what to build next, she claimed, where to add a room, when to tear down a wall. The house became her prison and her protection, growing around her like a shell, like a cocoon, like a maze designed by a mind coming apart at the seams. But here is where the story becomes truly unsettling. Because the question we must ask ourselves is this: was Sarah Winchester mad? Or did she know something we do not? Those who work at the house today, giving tours to curious visitors in the daylight hours, will tell you stories if you ask them quietly. Stories about the things that happen when the tourists leave. Footsteps in empty hallways. Doors that were locked at night found standing open at dawn. The sound of that phantom rain, tapping, always tapping. Wheelbarrows that move on their own in the basement. Cold spots that make your breath fog even on the warmest California afternoons. And in the séance room, some say, if you stand very still at midnight, you can hear whispering. A woman's voice, soft and desperate, asking the same question over and over. Have I built enough? Will they leave me alone now? Have I finally built enough? The Winchester Mystery House stands today as a monument to fear itself, to the things that haunt us, to the lengths we will go to escape what we believe is coming for us in the dark. Sarah Winchester died in 1922, falling asleep in her bedroom and never waking up. The hammers fell silent for the first time in 38 years. But the house remains, frozen in mid-construction, a snapshot of one woman's desperate attempt to outrun death itself. And on certain nights, when the rain falls on those labyrinthine rooftops, visitors and guards alike will pause and listen. Because sometimes, just sometimes, that sound seems to be coming from inside the walls, from rooms that have no rain above them, from hallways deep in the interior of that impossible house. Tap, dot, tap, dot, oi, tap, dot, dot, as if something is still building, still searching, still wandering those corridors. What you are about to discover will take you deep into the heart of this mystery, into the twisted hallways and dead-end staircases, into Sarah Winchester's tortured mind and the legend that consumed her life. We will walk through doors that lead nowhere and climb stairs that exist for no reason. We will stand in the séance room where she spoke to the dead. We will examine whether she was a woman driven mad by grief and guilt, or whether she knew something true and terrible that the rest of us have forgotten. The rain is falling now on the Winchester Mystery House. Can you hear it? Perhaps you should listen more carefully. In the spring of 1862, Sarah Lockwood Pardee walked down the aisle of the Congregational Church in New Haven, Connecticut, to marry a man whose family name would become synonymous with death. She was a striking young woman of 22, educated in the arts and fluent in multiple languages, with a delicate frame that stood just under 5 feet tall. Her groom, William Wirt Winchester, was the only son of Oliver Winchester, the shrewd industrialist who had transformed a failing shirt company into the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. The Winchesters had money, real money, and Sarah Pardee was joining a dynasty built on a very particular kind of American innovation. The rifles bearing the Winchester name were revolutionizing warfare and westward expansion, earning the nickname the gun that won the West. But every fortune has its foundation, and the Winchester fortune was being laid in lead and gunpowder, one bullet at a time. The Winchester Model 1866, which came to market the same year Sarah gave birth to her first and only child, could fire 15 rounds without reloading. This was a devastating advantage on the battlefield and on the frontier. During the Civil War, both Union and Confederate forces sought Winchester rifles, though the company officially supplied the North. Those repeating rifles changed the mathematics of killing. Where a soldier with a single-shot musket might fire 3 rounds per minute, a man with a Winchester could unleash a torrent of lead that transformed individual combat into something approaching mechanical slaughter. The rifles didn't just kill soldiers. They killed Native Americans defending their ancestral lands. They killed buffalo by the millions, the great herds that sustained entire civilizations reduced to mountains of bones bleaching in the prairie sun. They killed outlaws and lawmen, ranchers and rustlers, the guilty and the innocent alike. And with each death, each pull of the trigger, the Winchester family fortune grew. Sarah's life as a Winchester wife was one of privilege and comfort, but it was brief. In 1866, the same year the rifle model bore its date, Sarah delivered a daughter named Annie Pardee Winchester. The infant seemed healthy at first, a source of joy in the young couple's life. But within weeks, the baby began to fail. The illness came on suddenly, what doctors at the time called marasmus, a wasting disease that caused infants to simply fade away despite all efforts to save them. Sarah held her daughter as the child's weight dropped, as her cries weakened, as life itself seemed to drain from the tiny body. Annie Pardee Winchester died on July 24, 1866, barely 6 weeks old. She was buried in a small coffin in Evergreen Cemetery in New Haven, and something in Sarah Winchester broke that day that would never quite heal. The grief was all-consuming. Sarah fell into a depression so profound that those who knew her worried she might never emerge from it. She withdrew from society, her health deteriorated, and the vibrant, educated woman who had entered the Winchester family seemed to vanish, replaced by a shadow consumed by loss. For 15 years, she and William tried to rebuild some semblance of a life together. They never had another child. Perhaps they tried and failed, or perhaps the fear of losing another was too great to bear. William threw himself into the family business, learning the operations of the gun company that his father had built into an empire. But even as they moved forward through the motions of living, Sarah was haunted by the image of her daughter's grave, that small plot of earth that contained all her maternal hopes. Then, in March of 1881, William fell ill. Tuberculosis, the White Plague, the disease that had killed more people in the 19th century than any other. It was a cruel irony that the heir to a firearms fortune, surrounded by the most advanced killing technology of the age, would be felled by microscopic bacteria. Sarah watched her husband waste away, just as she had watched her infant daughter 15 years before. The same slow decline, the same helplessness, the same inevitable march toward death. William Wirt Winchester died on March 7, 1881, at the age of 43. Sarah was 41 years old, and suddenly, catastrophically alone. The inheritance that came to her was staggering. William left her approximately $20 million, a sum almost incomprehensible in that era. In modern terms, this would be worth well over $500 million. She also received an income of $1,000 per day from the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, a river of money that would flow to her for the rest of her life. Every single day, whether she slept or woke, whether she ate or starved, whether she built or destroyed, $1,000 would be hers. It was the kind of wealth that should have brought security, comfort, freedom from every material concern. Instead, it brought something else entirely. This was blood money in the most literal sense, currency stamped with the invisible marks of every person who had fallen before a Winchester rifle. And Sarah, in her grief-shattered state, was about to be told that those deaths had consequences that transcended the grave. The story goes that, in her desperation for answers, for some understanding of why she had lost everything, Sarah visited a medium in Boston. This was the height of the spiritualist movement in America, a time when grieving families flocked to séances hoping to contact lost loved ones beyond the veil of death. The medium, whose name has been lost to history, or perhaps never existed outside of legend, allegedly went into a trance and delivered a message that would change the trajectory of Sarah Winchester's entire life. The spirits were speaking, and they had a terrible truth to reveal. The Winchester family was cursed. The medium claimed that the ghosts of all those killed by Winchester rifles, thousands upon thousands of souls cut down in the Civil War on the frontier in acts of violence across the nation and beyond, were seeking vengeance on the family that profited from their deaths. These spirits, the medium said, had already taken Sarah's daughter and her husband, and Sarah herself would be next unless she followed very specific instructions. She must move west, the medium commanded. She must use the blood money fortune to build a house for the spirits. And most critically, she must never stop building. The construction must continue, day and night, year after year, without end. As long as the hammers were swinging, and the saws were cutting, and the house was growing, Sarah would live. But if the building ever stopped, if the work ever ceased, the spirits would know, and they would come for her just as they had come for her daughter and husband. The prophecy was both a curse and a roadmap, a life sentence of architectural obsession presented as the only path to survival. Whether this séance actually occurred, whether a medium really delivered this specific prophecy, is a matter of historical debate. There are no contemporary records of the visit, no documentation beyond the stories that emerged later. But what is undeniable is that something happened to Sarah Winchester in the months following her husband's death. Something transformed her from a grieving widow into a woman with a singular, all-consuming purpose. In 1883, just 2 years after William's death, Sarah left New Haven. She left behind the graves of her daughter and husband, the society that had known her as a Winchester bride, the life she had built in the shadow of the gun factory. She traveled west to California, to the Santa Clara Valley, where she purchased an unfinished farmhouse on 162 acres. And there, she began to build. But we must pause to understand the weight of what Sarah was carrying with her on that journey west. This was not simply grief, though the grief was real and profound. This was not simply fear of death, though that fear had been fed by unimaginable loss. This was the psychological burden of inheriting a fortune built on industrial-scale killing. Sarah was an educated woman, intelligent and cultured. She knew what the Winchester rifles had done. She had probably read the accounts of Civil War battles, of frontier conflicts, of the buffalo slaughter. She knew that her comfortable life, her wealth, her very identity as a Winchester was inseparable from violence and death. In the daylight, a rational mind might reconcile this, might argue that guns don't kill people, that her family simply manufactured tools, that the responsibility for death lay with those who pulled the triggers. But in the darkness, in the long nights of grief and isolation, such rational arguments crumble. In the darkness, the dead have voices. The medium's prophecy, whether real or imagined, whether delivered by an actual spiritualist or conjured by Sarah's own traumatized mind, gave shape to her guilt and fear. It transformed abstract moral weight into concrete supernatural threat. It took the diffuse anxiety of living on blood money and focused it into a specific, actionable terror. The spirits were coming. They were already responsible for her losses. And only constant, never-ending construction could keep them at bay. This belief, this obsession, would drive Sarah Winchester for the next 38 years. From 1884 until her death in 1922, construction on what would become known as the Winchester Mystery House never stopped. 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, workers hammered and sawed and built, expanding the house in increasingly bizarre and labyrinthine directions. The tragedy of Sarah Winchester is not simply the loss she endured, though those losses were devastating. The tragedy is how that loss, combined with immense wealth and the psychological burden of its origin, transformed a human being into a prisoner of her own obsession. She would spend millions of dollars building a house with doors that opened onto walls, staircases that led to ceilings, windows overlooking other rooms. She would conduct nightly séances in a room designed specifically for communicating with spirits, seeking their guidance on what to build next. She would sleep in a different bedroom each night, believing the ghosts could not find her if she kept moving. This was her life, purchased with blood money, driven by prophecy, consumed by the need to build, because stopping meant death. The widow Winchester had become something else entirely. A woman possessed not by spirits, but by the terrible weight of inheritance, and the crushing grip of grief transformed into architectural madness. And in California, the hammers would begin to fall, and they would not stop for nearly 4 decades. The sound reached Sarah Winchester before she even saw the property. A persistent tapping, like fingers drumming against wood, carried on the warm California breeze. But this was just the wind rattling loose boards on the unfinished farmhouse that stood at the edge of Santa Clara Valley. Soon enough, that tapping would become something far more constant, far more deliberate, and far more unsettling to everyone who lived within earshot. It was 1884 when Sarah stepped down from the train in San Jose, her black morning dress drawing curious stares from locals who didn't yet know they were witnessing the arrival of their city's most infamous future resident. The wealthy widow from New Haven, Connecticut, had traveled across the entire continent with a purpose that seemed, at first, perfectly ordinary. She was looking for a new home, a fresh start, somewhere far from the memories of tragedy that haunted her in the East. The farmhouse she purchased that autumn was nothing special by California standards. An 8-room structure sitting on 45 acres of farmland, partially completed, with good bones but little character. The previous owner had run out of money, or interest, or both, leaving behind a skeleton of a building that waited for someone to give it life. Sarah Winchester would give it life, certainly, but not in any way that anyone could have predicted. The hammering started within days of her arrival. Workers reported to the property on a Monday morning to find Mrs. Winchester already there, dressed immaculately despite the early hour, with architectural plans spread across makeshift tables. But these weren't the plans the previous owner had commissioned. These were new, drawn in Sarah's own hand, with modifications and additions that seemed to sprout from the original structure like branches from a trunk. The foreman, a man named John Hanson, according to local records, asked the obvious question: when would construction be complete? When could they expect to finish the work and move on to other projects? Sarah's answer would become the first of many strange proclamations that would echo through San Jose's growing collection of Winchester legends. Never, she told him. The work would never be complete. They would build and build and build, as long as she drew breath and had money to pay them. Hanson laughed, thinking it was the eccentricity of wealth, a rich woman's whim that would fade with the first winter rains. The rains came. The hammering continued. The sawing continued. The sound of men working wood and driving nails into timber continued through November, through December, through the darkest nights of January, when most sensible construction crews would have long since retired to warm beds and hot meals. Sarah paid premium wages for night shifts, double wages for midnight crews, triple wages for men willing to work through the hours when the rest of San Jose slept. There was never a shortage of workers willing to take her money, at least not at first. The architecture that emerged from this constant construction defied every convention that the carpenters and masons had learned in their trades. Sarah would order a room built, guide them through every measurement and specification, watch as they completed it to her exact standards, and then, sometimes within days, instruct them to seal it up again. Walls went up over perfectly good doorways. Windows were installed looking into closets or into other rooms rather than outside to the California sunshine. Staircases were built that led directly into ceilings, stopping abruptly as if the builder had simply forgotten that stairs needed somewhere to go. One particularly disturbing feature became known among the workers as the door to nowhere. On the second floor, Sarah had them install a beautiful door with polished brass fittings and intricate woodwork. It opened smoothly on well-oiled hinges, swinging outward in a way that seemed to invite someone to step through. But there was nothing beyond it except a sheer drop to the ground below. No balcony, no platform, no stairs, just empty air and a deadly fall waiting for anyone foolish or forgetful enough to walk through without looking. The workers talked, of course. Construction crews are made of men who spend long hours together, and those hours breed conversation. They gathered in the small San Jose saloons after their shifts, comparing notes about the increasingly bizarre requests from their employer. One carpenter swore that he'd built the same section of hallway 3 times in a single month, each time with slightly different dimensions that Sarah insisted were crucial, though she never explained why. A mason reported installing a window, removing it 2 days later, then reinstalling it in the exact same location a week after that. But the truly unsettling stories came from those who worked the night shifts, those souls who took Sarah's generous wages in exchange for laboring through the dark hours when San Jose lay sleeping. They reported seeing Mrs. Winchester wandering the unfinished corridors at odd hours, sometimes still in her morning dress, sometimes in a nightgown with a shawl pulled tight against the chill. She would stand in empty rooms with her arms outstretched, measuring invisible dimensions with her hands. Her lips would move as if in conversation, but there was never anyone visible standing with her in those incomplete spaces. Thomas Berry, a young framer who worked the midnight shift in 1886, gave an account to a local newspaper years later. He described watching Sarah through a gap in an unfinished wall, seeing her turn slowly in a circle in what would eventually become a bedroom, her hands tracing patterns in the air. She was speaking, he insisted, speaking clearly and with purpose, as if receiving instructions from someone he could not see. When he moved to get a better look, floorboards creaking under his weight, she stopped abruptly and stared directly at the wall where he stood hidden. For a long moment she simply looked, and Barry swore he felt his blood turn to ice. Then she smiled, nodded to the empty air beside her, and walked away. The bell tower became central to the mansion's growing legend. Sarah had it constructed in 1885, a structure tall enough to be seen from much of San Jose, with a bell that could be heard for miles when the wind was right. Every night, precisely at midnight, that bell would ring. Not the cheerful pealing of a church bell calling the faithful to worship, but a single solemn toll that echoed across the valley like a summons from the grave. And it was a summons, in a sense. Workers who stayed late or arrived early for their shifts reported seeing lights appear in the bell tower windows at that midnight hour. They saw Sarah climbing the stairs, moving with purpose toward a room she'd had constructed at the tower's base. The séance room, they called it, though Sarah herself never used that term in public. It was a small enclosed space with only one door, fitted with special hinges that Sarah had ordered from San Francisco. The door could only be opened from the inside, ensuring absolute privacy for whatever rituals took place within. Local spiritualists, and San Jose had no shortage of them in the 1880s, recognized the signs immediately. The midnight hour, the sealed room, the constant construction with no apparent plan or endpoint. Sarah Winchester, they whispered in their own gatherings, was building according to instructions from beyond the veil. The spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles, some said. The ghosts of her dead husband and infant daughter, others claimed. Benevolent entities trying to help her find peace, or malevolent forces driving her toward madness. The theories multiplied like the rooms of her expanding mansion. a housekeeper named Mary Jo Ignoffo, though this name appears in later records and may be a composite of several domestic workers, described a typical midnight ritual according to accounts passed down through San Jose families. Sarah would dismiss all servants from certain sections of the house before 11:30. She would make her way to the séance room alone, carrying only a candle for light. The bell would toll, and behind the sealed door, witnesses claimed to hear Sarah's voice rising and falling as if in conversation. Sometimes there was singing, old hymns from her New England childhood. Sometimes there was weeping. Sometimes there was laughter that made the listener's skin crawl, because it sounded nothing like the reserved, dignified woman they knew by daylight. When she emerged, usually around 2 in the morning, she would seek out the night foreman with new instructions. Build a room here. Tear down a wall there. Install a window facing north. No, make it northwest. No, exactly 17 degrees from north. The specificity of her demands suggested careful planning, but the randomness of their implementation suggested something else entirely. It was as if she were taking dictation from architects who existed in a dimension where normal rules of space and structure simply didn't apply. The mansion grew like a tumor, spreading across the Santa Clara Valley with no regard for symmetry or sense. Rooms were added onto rooms, which connected to hallways that led to more rooms, which opened into courtyards that were then covered over and converted into interior spaces. The original 8-room farmhouse disappeared entirely, swallowed by the constantly expanding structure that some workers began calling the Mystery House, though that name wouldn't become official for many years. By 1887, just 3 years after Sarah's arrival, the building had grown to include more than 100 rooms. By 1890, that number had doubled. The construction crews, rotating in shifts that never ended, began to lose track of the mansion's total size. Rooms were built and sealed before they could be properly counted. Hallways were reconfigured so often that maps became obsolete within weeks of being drawn. San Jose, still a relatively small city in those days, watched the Winchester mansion's growth with a mixture of fascination and horror. Respectable citizens, the kind who attended church on Sundays and minded their own business the rest of the week, began crossing to the other side of the street when Sarah's carriage passed. Children were warned to stay away from the property, though of course that only made it more enticing to young adventurers who would dare each other to approach the walls and listen to the constant hammering that never, ever stopped. The sound became part of San Jose's identity, as much a feature of the city as the orchards and vineyards that surrounded it. Visitors remarked on it in letters home. The constant noise of construction from the widow's house, they wrote, hammering at dawn, sawing at noon, nailing at midnight, a percussion of industry that acknowledged no Sabbath, no holiday, no rest. And through it all, Sarah Winchester remained an enigma. She spoke little to those outside her household staff and construction crews. She attended no social functions, joined no clubs, made no effort to integrate into San Jose society despite her obvious wealth. Her only companions, some said, were the spirits she consulted in that midnight séance room, the invisible architects whose instructions she followed with absolute devotion. The legend grew with the house, spreading beyond San Jose to San Francisco and beyond. The mad widow building her haunted palace. The rifle heiress trying to appease the ghosts of those killed by her family's guns. The eccentric millionaire with more money than sense, throwing fortunes at a construction project that would never end because ending it would mean confronting the silence she seemed desperate to avoid. But those who worked closest to her, those who saw her measuring empty air and speaking to corners where no one stood, they knew something the gossips didn't. Whether Sarah Winchester was mad or inspired, whether she was haunted or enlightened, she was absolutely convinced that what she was doing was necessary. The spirits demanded it, she told her foreman. The building must never stop, she insisted to her architects. And so it didn't, not for 38 years, not until the day she died, and the hammers finally fell silent, leaving behind a monument to obsession that still stands as a testament to one woman's strange and terrible vision. The first thing visitors notice when they step inside the Winchester Mystery House is that nothing makes sense. The front door opens to reveal a small, ordinary entryway, But within steps, the laws of architecture seem to bend and break. The house doesn't unfold logically like normal buildings do. Instead, it sprawls in every direction with a kind of desperate, frantic energy, as if the woman who built it was trying to outrun something that existed just beyond the walls. Stand at the base of one particular staircase on the second floor, and you can see it clearly. The steps rise normally at first, 7 of them climbing at a standard angle, with a polished handrail gleaming beside them. Your eye follows the stairs upward, expecting them to lead to a hallway or another room. But they don't. At the top of the 7th step, the staircase simply ends, pressing flat against the ceiling with nowhere to go. The craftsmanship is impeccable. Each stair is precisely measured, the wood grain perfectly aligned, the risers uniform and smooth. Someone built this staircase with great care and skill, knowing full well it would lead absolutely nowhere. According to the story that has been told and retold for over a century, Sarah Winchester built these stairs to confuse evil spirits. The ghost of a psychic medium allegedly told her that she was cursed, haunted by everyone killed by Winchester rifles, and that the only way to appease these vengeful souls was to keep building, never stopping, always adding more rooms, more hallways, more confusion. The spirits, according to this theory, would get lost in the maze of architecture and leave her alone. But stand beneath that staircase long enough, and other questions begin to surface. If you were truly trying to confuse spirits, would you build one staircase to nowhere, or would you build dozens? The answer becomes clear as you move through the house. There are staircases everywhere, and many of them make no sense at all. Some rise a few feet and stop at blank walls. Others spiral upward in tight circles, climbing higher and higher before depositing visitors at doors that open into walls. One staircase descends into what appears to be a basement, but halfway down, the steps become shelves, transforming from passage to storage, as if the house itself couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Walk to the second floor, to a particular door painted the same pale color as all the others. The doorknob turns smoothly, well-oiled and functional. Push the door open, and you find yourself staring down at the garden below, a drop of nearly 15 feet, with nothing but empty air between the threshold and the ground. There's no balcony, no platform, no stairs leading down. Just a door that opens to a void, an invitation to step out into nothing. Some say this was a trap for ghosts. The spirits, confused by the strange layout of the house, would wander the halls at night and eventually open this door, falling through to whatever dimension exists below our own. Others point out something darker. A 15-foot fall onto hard ground might not kill a person, but it would certainly injure them. Was Sarah Winchester building traps for the living as well as the dead? Was she so paranoid, so convinced that enemies surrounded her, that she built deadly architecture into her own home? The door stands open during tours now, a rope barrier preventing anyone from accidentally stepping through. Visitors crowd around it, taking photographs, marveling at its strangeness. But if you look closely at the door frame, you can see something else. The wood around the hinges is worn smooth, suggesting this door was opened and closed many times over the years. Someone used this door regularly, knew exactly where it led, and opened it anyway. Perhaps to check on the garden below. Perhaps for reasons we can't understand. The number 13 appears everywhere in the Winchester house, repeated with an obsessive precision that goes far beyond coincidence. There are 13 bathrooms, though the house was built in an era when most mansions had 3 or 4 at most. Walk into certain rooms, and you'll find exactly 13 windows, no more, no less, even when the room's dimensions would logically call for a different number. The drain covers in the sinks and showers feature 13 holes, custom made for this house alone. Chandeliers hang from ceilings with exactly 13 lights, their crystal prisms casting 13 distinct patterns on the walls below. Count the steps on specific staircases, and your foot lands on the 13th step just as you reach a landing or a turn. Not 12, not 14. Always 13. The consistency is unnerving because it requires planning, deliberate design, a mind that counted and recounted to ensure the number appeared again and again throughout the structure. In Western culture, 13 has long been considered unlucky, associated with death and misfortune. Judas was the 13th guest at the Last Supper. Friday the 13th carries a superstitious weight that affects everything from wedding dates to stock market behavior. Most tall buildings skip the 13th floor entirely, jumping from 12 to 14 to avoid the number's dark associations. But Sarah Winchester didn't avoid 13. She embraced it, wove it into every aspect of her house, as if the number itself held some kind of power. Some paranormal researchers believe 13 was meant as a protective symbol, a way of taking the number's negative energy and turning it into a barrier against hostile spirits. By surrounding herself with 13s, Sarah might have been creating a kind of numerical shield, a mathematical ward that kept the ghosts at bay. Others suggest the opposite, that she was trying to attract specific spirits, the 13 soldiers or hunters or victims who might have mercy on her where others would not. But there's another possibility that historians are beginning to explore. What if the number 13 had personal significance to Sarah Winchester that had nothing to do with ghosts? What if it connected to a date, a memory, an event in her life that we've lost to time? The obsessive repetition suggests not superstition but grief. The way a person might trace the same pattern over and over, trying to hold on to something that's slipping away. The craftsmanship throughout the house reveals a strange contradiction. Stand in front of one particular Tiffany glass window, and you can see the artistry immediate. The glass glows with deep blues and greens, forming intricate patterns that must have cost thousands of dollars even in the late 1800s. The lead work is exquisite, each piece of glass fitted perfectly into place. Light filters through the colored panes, casting jeweled shadows across the floor. It's the kind of window that belongs in a cathedral or a mansion's grand entrance, positioned to catch the morning sun and transform it into something transcendent. But this window faces an interior wall. No natural light reaches it, ever. It was installed in a location where its beauty would never be properly illuminated, where its purpose could never be fulfilled. The window exists in permanent shadow, its colors muted and dull, visible only by artificial light that can't do justice to the glassmaker's art. Walk through the house and you'll find this pattern repeated. Gorgeous windows installed where no one would see them. Ornate doors that open into walls. A cabinet in one room appears normal until you try to open it and you realize it's only 1 inch deep, too shallow to hold anything at all. The shelves are real, the doors function properly, the wood is polished and beautiful, but the entire structure is utterly useless. Someone spent hours building a cabinet that could never serve as a cabinet, creating a perfect illusion of function with no substance behind it. The chimney is present, perhaps the most baffling example of this craftsmanship, mixed with madness. One particular chimney rises from the first floor, built from thousands of bricks precisely mortared together. It climbs through the second floor, through the third floor, rising 4 full stories with the kind of engineering that requires serious skill. Chimneys need to be structurally sound, properly vented, capable of withstanding heat and weather. This one was clearly built by someone who knew what they were doing. But it stops. 3 feet short of the roof, the chimney simply ends, open to the attic, unable to vent smoke or serve any purpose. It's a monument to futility. 4 floors of expert construction, leading nowhere. The theories about why Sarah Winchester built these architectural impossibilities have evolved over the decades. The ghost story explanation remains the most popular, the idea that she was following instructions from spirits who demanded confusion and chaos to keep other spirits at bay. It's a neat narrative, easy to understand, fitting well with the image of a grief-stricken widow desperate for supernatural guidance. But spend time with architectural historians who studied the house and you'll hear different theories. Some point out that Sarah Winchester was a wealthy, intelligent woman who had unprecedented freedom to build whatever she wanted. No husband told her what to do. No father controlled her finances. She inherited a fortune from the Winchester Rifle Company and had complete autonomy over how to spend it. What if the house wasn't about ghosts at all, but about experimentation? What if she was testing ideas, trying new things, building and rebuilding until she found designs that pleased her aesthetic sense, regardless of their practical function? The constant construction kept dozens of workers employed year-round for 38 years. Every day, carpenters, masons, glaziers, and craftsmen came to the house and worked 12-hour shifts. The hammering never stopped. The sawing continued from dawn until midnight. For a woman who had lost her infant daughter to a childhood disease and her husband to tuberculosis, who lived alone in a massive house with only servants for company. The noise and activity might have been a comfort. The construction wasn't about confusing ghosts. It was about filling silence, about having life and movement and purpose surrounding her at all times. Some psychologists who have studied Sarah Winchester's story suggest the architecture reflects a specific type of trauma response. The staircases that lead nowhere might represent paths she couldn't take, futures that ended before they began. The doors opening into empty space could symbolize choices that led to falls, decisions that resulted in loss. The obsessive repetition of 13 might be a form of magical thinking. The belief that if she just got the number right, repeated it enough times, something would change, something would heal. The house as a physical manifestation of a fractured mind makes a certain terrible sense. If you were trying to externalize grief, to build your internal landscape into wood and glass and stone, it might look exactly like this. The beautiful windows facing nowhere, the cabinets too shallow to hold anything, the chimneys that can't fulfill their purpose. All of it speaks to a life that appeared functional from the outside, but felt hollow within. But that theory, compelling as it sounds, might be too simple. It reduces Sarah Winchester to her trauma, assumes she was broken rather than complex. The house could also represent defiance, a wealthy woman's refusal to build what was expected of her. Every strange door, an impossible staircase, might have been a deliberate choice, a way of saying that her house would follow her rules, not society's. Stand in the center of the Winchester Mystery House today, surrounded by its beautiful madness, and you realize that the truth probably contains elements of all these theories. Sarah Winchester was grieving and experimental, traumatized and defiant, following spirits or following her own strange vision. The house she created defies easy explanation because people defy easy explanation. We are all contradictions, all impossible architectures of desire and fear and memory. Sarah Winchester simply had the money and the time and the determination to build her contradictions into something you can walk through. Something that endures long after she's gone, still confusing us, still raising questions that have no satisfying answers. The spirits she might have been trying to trap or confuse or appease were perhaps less important than the act of building itself, the daily work of creating something that made sense only to her, in a world that had stopped making sense entirely. The servants who worked for Sarah Winchester in the final decades of her life learned quickly never to question what they heard in the darkness. Emma Holt, who served as a housemaid from 1896 until 1902, kept a diary that remained in her family's possession for generations before being made available to researchers. In its pages, she described nights when the hammering would not stop, even though she knew the construction crews had gone home hours before. She would lie in her small room on the third floor, listening to the phantom sounds of sawing and the dragging of heavy boards across wooden floors. What disturbed her most, she wrote, was not the invisible construction itself, but the fact that it seemed to follow a pattern. The sounds would begin shortly after midnight, always in rooms that had been recently completed, as if some unseen workforce was reviewing the day's progress and finding it wanting. Another servant, Thomas Miller, who worked as a groundskeeper from 1903 to 1908, reported something even more unsettling. He told his family that on at least a dozen occasions, while making his final rounds of the property before bed, he encountered Mrs. Winchester standing in empty rooms, speaking clearly and deliberately to spaces where no one else stood. She would gesture toward walls and corners, nodding as if receiving instructions, then respond with specific architectural direction. "Move that doorway 3 feet to the left," she would say. "The spirits insist the staircase must turn back on itself." Miller said he learned to simply continue walking when he witnessed these scenes, understanding that his employer was consulting with advisors only she could perceive. The night staff developed their own folklore about which rooms to avoid after dark. The blue room, which Sarah apparently used for her séances, became particularly notorious. Multiple servants reported that the temperature in that space would drop suddenly and inexplicably, even on warm summer evenings. Mary Hennessy, who worked as a cook from 1905 to 1910, refused to enter the blue room after 8 o'clock at night under any circumstances. She told her daughter years later that she had once been sent to retrieve a shawl Mrs. Winchester had left there, and upon entering, She felt what she described as invisible hands pressing against her shoulders, firmly, but not violently, pushing her back toward the door. The message was clear. She was not welcome in that space after dark. But perhaps the most compelling historical account comes from Arthur Olson, who served as the night watchman from 1914 to 1920. In a letter to his brother in San Francisco, he described hearing footsteps throughout the house during his rounds. Not the random creaks of an old building settling, but deliberate, purposeful footsteps that seemed to move with intention from room to room. He wrote that he could track the sound's progress through the hallways, hear it climb staircases, and listen as it paused before doorways, exactly as a person would pause before entering a new space. On one occasion, he followed the footsteps to the grand ballroom, arriving just in time to hear what sounded like a woman's skirts rustling across the polished floor, though the room stood completely empty when he lit his lantern. After Sarah Winchester's death in 1922, the house sat largely unused for several years before eventually becoming a tourist attraction. The caretakers hired to maintain the property during this transition period reported phenomena that suggested whatever presence inhabited the mansion had not departed with its creator's death. In fact, many claimed the activity seemed to intensify, as if the house itself had absorbed something essential from the decades of continuous construction, and now existed as a kind of architectural vessel for accumulated spiritual energy. James Garrett, who worked as the primary caretaker from 1925 to 1931, kept detailed logs of his experiences. He noted that the grand ballroom, which had remained largely unused during Sarah's lifetime, became a source of recurring strangeness. On at least 20 occasions, he documented hearing organ music emanating from that space, despite the fact that no organ had been installed there for years. The music, he wrote, always played the same melody, a mournful tune that seemed to rise and fall with its own melancholic rhythm. He would unlock the ballroom and find it empty, silent, and still, with no explanation for what he and others had clearly heard just moments before. The wheelbarrow phenomenon began appearing in caretaker reports as early as 1933. Multiple employees described finding wheelbarrows in the basement, moved from their normal storage positions, sometimes arranged in deliberate patterns or lined up as if ready for a work crew that never materialized. Daniel Richardson, who maintained the property through the 1940s, became so disturbed by this recurring event that he began marking the exact positions of tools and equipment with chalk. He would return the following morning to find the wheelbarrows moved several feet away, with the chalk marks still visible in their original locations, proving the movement was real and not a trick of memory or perception. Modern tour guides and security personnel have added their own chapters to this growing collection of unexplained experiences. The cold spots, particularly in the séance room, have become so reliably present that they are now part of the unofficial tour guide training. Jennifer Walsh, who worked as a guide from 2003 to 2008, described the sensation as walking into an invisible column of Arctic air. The cold is not gradual, she explained in an interview with Paranormal researchers. It is absolute and immediate, as if you have stepped through a barrier into a different atmospheric zone entirely. She noted that the cold spot moved over the years, appearing in different corners of the room, but always maintaining the same intense, localized quality. But it is the rain phenomena that has captured the attention of serious paranormal investigators and skeptics alike. The correlation between stormy weather and increased activity in the Winchester house has been documented across more than 8 decades of witness accounts. During storms, staff members consistently report a dramatic escalation in auditory phenomena. The phantom footsteps become more frequent and more distinct. The sound of construction that so troubled the original servants returns with renewed vigor. Most strikingly, witnesses report hearing voices, conversations carried on in rooms that remain empty when investigated. Margaret Chen, a tour guide who worked at the property from 2009 to 2015, described her experience during a particularly intense rainstorm in February of 2012. She was closing up the house for the evening, making her final rounds, when the rain began hammering against the windows with unusual force. As she walked through the upper corridors, she became aware of voices echoing through the halls. Not ghostly whispers or ambiguous sounds, but clear human voices engaged in what sounded like a heated discussion. She could not make out specific words, but the rhythm and cadence of conversation were unmistakable. Following the sound, she traced it to a sealed room, one of the many spaces that tourists cannot access. The voices seemed to originate from just beyond the locked door. But when security personnel opened the room minutes later, they found it empty, dusty, and showing no signs of recent disturbance. The theory that rain somehow activates or amplifies the paranormal energy in the house has been explored by multiple research teams. Some suggest that water acts as a conductor for spiritual energy, creating optimal conditions for manifestation. Others propose that the sound of rain itself, beating against the mansion's many windows and echoing through its labyrinthine passages, creates auditory conditions that make existing phenomena more perceptible to human ears. A few researchers have noted that Sarah Winchester herself was known to work more intensely during storms, as if the rain provided her with clearer communication with her spirit guides. The most compelling piece of modern evidence comes from Robert Davidson, a security guard who worked the overnight shift from 2016 to 2019. Davidson, a skeptic by nature and a former military police officer, decided to conduct his own investigation of the house's reputation. With permission from management, he placed audio recording devices in several of the sealed rooms, spaces that no one had entered for months and that tourists never accessed. He was particularly interested in the North Wing, where Victorian-era servants had reported the most intense phantom construction sounds. For 3 consecutive nights in October of 2017, during a series of autumn storms, Davidson recorded hours of audio from these sealed spaces. When he reviewed the recordings, he discovered something that challenged his skeptical worldview. On multiple occasions, the audio captured what sounded unmistakably like a woman's voice, low and deliberate, speaking words that Davidson eventually transcribed with the help of audio enhancement software. The voice appeared to be giving construction instructions. Raise that beam another 6 inches. The angle must be precisely 45 degrees. They insist on authenticity. Davidson shared these recordings with acoustic specialists, who confirmed that the voice was present in the original recordings, and not the result of audio artifacts or interference. What makes Davidson's evidence particularly significant is the context. These recordings were made in rooms that had been locked and sealed. No one had physical access to these spaces during the recording period. The audio equipment itself was examined by technical experts who found no evidence of malfunction or external signal interference. The voice, whatever its source, appeared to originate from within the sealed rooms themselves. Paranormal researchers have proposed that the Winchester Mystery House functions as what they call a spirit trap, an architectural structure that was intentionally designed to attract and contain supernatural energy. Sarah Winchester's decades of construction, her séances, her conversations with the dead, and her apparent belief that the house served as a kind of gateway between worlds may have created exactly what she intended, a space where the boundary between the living and the dead becomes permeable, where the accumulated energy of 100 years of belief and ritual has transformed wood and stone into something more than a simple building. The house, according to this theory, has become a battery of sorts, storing spiritual energy that builds over time and discharges during specific conditions, particularly during storms when atmospheric pressure changes and water saturates the air. Each witness account, each unexplained sound, each cold spot and phantom footstep adds another layer to this accumulated charge. The mansion does not merely house spirit. It has become a spirit itself, a conscious entity built from human intention and sustained by a century of belief in its supernatural purpose. The night of September 4th, 1922, began like any other at the Winchester Mystery House. Somewhere in the labyrinth of corridors and half-finished rooms, hammers struck nails with rhythmic precision. Saws worked through fresh lumber. The sounds that had been the constant heartbeat of this strange estate for 38 years echoed through the 7-story mansion as they had every single day since 1884. But before dawn, something unprecedented happened. The hammering stopped. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, silence fell over the property. It was the kind of silence that felt wrong, unnatural, like the sudden absence of a sound you'd stopped consciously hearing years ago, but had always been there, buried in the background of your awareness. The workers who arrived that morning, men who had spent years adding rooms that led nowhere and stairs that climbed into ceilings, immediately felt it. They would later describe an overwhelming sense of dread that settled over the grounds like a heavy fog, a feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the fabric of the house itself. Sarah Winchester, the woman who had driven this endless construction project with an obsession bordering on madness, had died in her sleep. She was 82 years old. For 38 years, she had believed that as long as the hammering continued, as long as new rooms were being added and hallways extended into impossible geometries, the spirits that haunted her would be satisfied. The ghosts of those killed by Winchester rifles, the specter of her dead infant daughter Annie, the shade of her departed husband William, they would all be appeased by the ceaseless building. Now, in the pre-dawn hours of that September morning, her heart had simply stopped, and with it, the construction that had consumed her entire adult life came to an abrupt and final end. The workers who discovered that she had passed spoke of walking through rooms that morning and feeling as though the house itself was holding its breath. One carpenter, a man named Thomas who had worked on the property for over a decade, later told reporters that he knew something was wrong the moment he stepped onto the grounds. The air felt different, he said. Heavier. He described it as the feeling you get when you walk into a room where someone has just died, that peculiar atmospheric shift that seems to happen in the presence of fresh death, except it permeated the entire sprawling estate. When Sarah's relatives arrived from the East Coast to settle her affairs, they were confronted with the true strangeness of what she had created. The house was a maze that defied logic and reason. Staircases that climbed 7 steps and then stopped at a ceiling. Doors that opened onto brick walls or sheer drops to the gardens below. Windows set into floors. Hallways that twisted back on themselves in impossible loops. And at the heart of this architectural madness, they found Sarah's bedroom, the inner sanctum where she had spent her nights, and it was unlike any bedroom they had ever seen. The room was boarded up, not from the outside, but from within. Heavy planks had been nailed across the interior walls in a pattern that seemed almost ritualistic. The windows were sealed shut, allowing only thin slivers of light to penetrate the gloom. There was only one way in and one way out. A small door, barely large enough for a woman of Sarah's slight frame to squeeze through. The relatives stood outside this door, looking at each other with a mixture of confusion and growing unease. What kind of woman seals herself inside her own bedroom every night? What was she keeping out? Or perhaps more disturbingly, what was she keeping in? When they finally entered, using tools to pry open the small door, they found themselves in what could only be described as a shrine to the dead and a workshop for communing with spirits. The air inside was stale and thick with the smell of old incense and something else, something organic and slightly sweet that made their stomachs turn. Heavy curtains blocked what little light the sealed windows might have allowed. The furniture was sparse, but carefully arranged, positioned according to some system that made sense only to Sarah. On a table in the center of the room, they discovered papers covered in Sarah's careful handwriting. Charts and diagrams filled page after page, intricate designs that mapped out what appeared to be spirit communication patterns. There were columns of numbers, most notably the number 13 appearing over and over again in various calculations and lists. Circles within circles, geometric patterns that seemed to serve some occult purpose. Instructions written in a cipher that none of the relatives could immediately understand. This was the evidence of Sarah's nightly séances, the private rituals she had conducted alone in this sealed room, communicating with the spirits that she believed controlled her fate. In a small wooden box lined with velvet, they found locks of hair. 2 of them, each tied with a thin ribbon. One lock was fine and soft, the hair of an infant, taken from Annie Winchester before she was buried, the daughter who had died at just 6 weeks old in 1866. The other was coarser, darker, the hair of a grown man, cut from William Winchester's head either before or shortly after his death from tuberculosis in 1881. Sarah had carried these physical remnants of her lost family with her across the country, had kept them close for over 40 years, had perhaps used them in her seances as focal points for reaching beyond the veil. Hanging on a hook behind the door, they found a black robe. It was made of heavy fabric, the kind that would have been uncomfortable in California's warm climate, designed not for comfort, but for ceremony. This was Sarah's séance robe, the garment she wore when she believed she was in the presence of spirits. The fabric was worn smooth in places from years of use, and there were stains near the hem that might have been wax from candles, or something else entirely that the relatives preferred not to contemplate too closely. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was not what they found in Sarah's room, but what they learned about the house itself when the estate was appraised. The mansion, this sprawling testament to architectural madness that covered 6 acres and contained 160 rooms, was valued at just $5,000. $5,000, when Sarah had spent an estimated $5.5 million on its construction over 38 years. Even accounting for the decline in value due to the strange and impractical design, the number made no sense. The building materials alone should have been worth far more. The appraisers who walked through the property with their notebooks and measuring tapes came to a conclusion that sent chills through everyone involved in settling the estate. The house, they reported, was essentially worthless as a dwelling. No one could live in it comfortably. The heating system, such as it was, made no sense, with some rooms having multiple fireplaces while others had none. The plumbing followed no rational plan. Rooms that should have been bedrooms had no closets, while closets the size of bedrooms had been built with no apparent purpose. The structure itself, despite decades of work, was fundamentally unsound in places, with walls that supported nothing and supports that held up walls that didn't need them. The inescapable conclusion was one that the relatives did not want to voice aloud, but that hung in the air nonetheless. Sarah had never built this house for the living. Every door that opened onto a wall, every staircase that led nowhere, every window set into a floor, these were not mistakes or the whims of an eccentric old woman. They were deliberate constructions meant to confuse and trap spirits, to create a dwelling place for the dead rather than the living. The $5,000 valuation was not an insult or an error. It was an honest assessment of a building that had been designed from the ground up to be uninhabitable by anyone with a corporeal form. The workers who had helped build this impossible structure were let go, their services no longer needed now that the driving force behind the construction had departed. But they did not leave quietly, or without looking back. In the weeks and months following Sarah's death, many of them reported experiences that defied rational explanation. They spoke in hushed tones in local taverns and gathering places, sharing stories that they knew made them sound mad, but that they insisted were absolutely true. On rainy nights, they said, when the fog rolled in from the San Francisco Bay and wrapped the abandoned mansion in thick gray shrouds, you could hear the hammering start again. The rhythmic bang of hammers on nails, the rasping sound of saws working through lumber, the creaking of wood being bent and shaped. The sounds came from deep within the house, from rooms that stood empty and unoccupied, from floors that had been sealed off and abandoned. The phantom construction crew, some of the workers claimed, consisted of the spirits that Sarah had been building for all those years, and now that she was gone, they continued the work themselves, driven by the same obsessive need that had consumed her. One former carpenter swore that he returned to the property 3 weeks after Sarah's death to retrieve a toolbox he had left behind. It was late evening, and as he approached the house, he heard the unmistakable sound of construction coming from the upper floors. The clang of metal on metal, the scrape of wood on wood, the muffled thuds of materials being moved. He stood frozen on the path, staring up at the dark windows, and he could have sworn he saw shadows moving inside, the silhouettes of workers passing back and forth behind the glass, even though he knew with absolute certainty that the house stood empty. Another worker, a man who had specialized in the intricate woodwork that decorated many of the rooms, reported an even more disturbing experience. He claimed that on a particularly stormy night about 2 months after Sarah's passing, he was walking past the property when he heard not just the sounds of construction, but a voice. A woman's voice, thin and reedy with age, calling out instructions. He couldn't make out the specific words, but the cadence and tone were unmistakable. It was Sarah Winchester, directing her phantom crew, ensuring that even in death, the work she had begun would never truly stop. The locals, who had watched the strange mansion grow and evolve over nearly 4 decades, found these stories entirely believable. They had seen Sarah's obsession firsthand. They had witnessed the way she drove the construction with single-minded determination, never satisfied, never complete, always adding one more room, one more hallway, one more staircase to nowhere. Why would death stop her? Why would the spirits she had spent her life appeasing suddenly be satisfied now that she was gone? The house stands to this day, preserved now as a monument to one woman's descent into obsession and madness. Tour guides lead visitors through the twisted corridors, pointing out the architectural impossibilities and telling sanitized versions of Sarah's story. But those who work there late at night, the security guards and maintenance staff who walk those empty halls when the tourists have gone home, they sometimes report hearing things that shouldn't be there. The distant echo of hammering, the faint whisper of a saw, the soft thud of footsteps in rooms that stand empty. On September 4th, 1922, the hammering stopped at the Winchester Mystery House. But according to those who know, according to those who listen carefully on foggy nights, when the house is wrapped in silence and shadow, it never truly ended. The construction continues, driven not by the needs of the living but by the eternal demands of the dead, a project that can never be completed because it was never meant to be. Sarah Winchester spent 38 years building a house for ghosts, and in the end, she may have succeeded better than anyone could have imagined. The rain falls differently at the Winchester Mystery House. Anyone who has spent time there will tell you this, though they struggle to explain exactly what they mean. Perhaps it's the way the drops seem to echo through those 161 rooms, creating a symphony of sounds that shouldn't quite harmonize the way they do. Or maybe it's something deeper, something that has less to do with acoustics and more to do with the veil between worlds growing thin when water falls from darkened skies. For over a century now, investigators have walked those twisted hallways, climbed those stairs that lead nowhere, and stood in rooms sealed off from the living world. They've brought their equipment, their theories, their carefully constructed frameworks of understanding. They've measured electromagnetic fields and recorded electronic voice phenomena. They've documented cold spots and shadow figures. They've filled volumes with data, with testimony, with evidence both compelling and controversial. And yet, despite all of this accumulated knowledge, despite all the years of scrutiny and study, we remain no closer to understanding the true heart of the mystery. We still cannot answer the most fundamental question of all. What was Sarah Winchester really doing during those 38 years of ceaseless construction? Was she mad, as so many have claimed? The conventional narrative paints her as a woman broken by grief, driven to irrationality by the loss of her infant daughter and her husband, manipulated by a Boston medium into believing that vengeful spirits demanded an eternal construction project. It's a tidy explanation, one that allows us to file her away comfortably in the category of tragic eccentrics, victims of their own delusions and the superstitions of a less enlightened age. But those who study her life more carefully find a different picture emerging. Here was a woman who managed a $50 million inheritance with remarkable acumen, who designed architectural innovations that wouldn't be widely adopted for decades, who spoke 4 languages and was known for her intelligence and education. Her charitable donations were substantial and thoughtfully directed. Her business dealings were shrewd and successful. This does not sound like madness. This sounds like someone working with intention, with purpose, toward goals we simply haven't understood. Perhaps grief was her primary motivator, but grief that manifested not as insanity, but as desperate hope. Imagine losing everyone you love, being left alone with wealth that feels like a curse, and being offered even the smallest possibility of connection with those you've lost. Wouldn't you grasp at it? Wouldn't you build anything? Try anything? If it meant one more moment with the child you held for only 6 weeks, with the husband taken far too soon? Or was she truly in communication with something beyond our understanding? The accounts are too numerous, too consistent across decades, to dismiss entirely. Staff members who worked for her reported seeing her consulting with invisible presences in the night. Construction workers spoke of receiving their instructions through her from sources they could not perceive. The architectural choices themselves suggest a blueprint that originated from somewhere other than conventional human planning. The rooms that serve no practical purpose, the doors that open onto walls, the windows that look into other rooms rather than outside. These are not the random choices of dementia. They follow patterns, rules that belong to a logic we haven't cracked. And then there are those sealed rooms, the spaces she ordered closed off and never reopened. What lies behind those walls? Official explanations suggest earthquake damage, structural issues, areas that failed to meet her standards. Those who've studied the house note something peculiar. Many of the sealed spaces were closed off deliberately, carefully, during periods when construction was active in adjacent areas. They weren't abandoned. They were completed and then isolated. What did Sarah Winchester lock away? What did she build that she decided the world should not see? The question that haunts us most persistently, though, is the connection between the rain and the intensification of paranormal activity. Scientific explanations exist. Theories about barometric pressure affecting electromagnetic fields, about humidity and its impact on perception. But these feel insufficient when you're standing in the house during a storm, when you hear footsteps in empty corridors and voices in sealed rooms, when you feel the unmistakable sensation of being watched by eyes that belong to no living thing. Some researchers have proposed that Sarah understood something fundamental about the nature of spiritual energy, that she designed the house not merely to shelter spirits, but to harness the power that storms provide. The towers that serve no apparent purpose, the strange angles and impossible geometries, the way certain rooms seem to focus and amplify sound. What if these weren't mistakes or madness but components of a machine we lack the knowledge to recognize? What if Sarah Winchester was building something that operated according to principles we've yet to discover? The house remains one of the most actively investigated paranormal locations in America. New phenomena are reported with remarkable regularity. Security cameras capture shadows that move independently of any light source. Audio recordings pick up voices speaking in rooms that have been empty for decades. Visitors experience sensations ranging from gentle touches to overwhelming dread. And on rainy nights, all of this intensifies. Did Sarah succeed in her mission, whatever that mission truly was? Did she create a sanctuary for spirits? A place where the dead could find shelter and perhaps peace? The continued activity suggests something is still there, still present, still active within those walls. Whether these are the spirits she sought to help, or something else entirely remains unknown. There's a darker possibility that some researchers whisper about, a theory that perhaps Sarah didn't just attract spirits but trap them. That the labyrinthine design wasn't meant to confuse malevolent entities but to capture and contain them. That she built not a sanctuary but a prison, and the activity we detect now is not peaceful habitation, but the desperate attempts of something that wants out. The construction stopped on September 5, 1922, when Sarah Winchester died in her sleep at the age of 83. The hammers fell silent for the first time in nearly 4 decades. The workers packed their tools and departed. The house, with its estimated 10,000 windows, 2,000 doors, and 47 fireplaces, was finally finished. Except, perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps it never will be. There are those who believe that the construction continues in dimensions we cannot perceive, that Sarah Winchester's work transcended the physical plane even before her death, that what she was building exists partially in our world and partially in another. They point to the way the house seems to change, the way even longtime employees sometimes find themselves lost in familiar corridors, the way rooms seem different depending on when you enter them. They suggest that the boundary between our reality and whatever lies beyond is thinner here, more permeable, deliberately worn away by decades of intention and effort. Perhaps Sarah Winchester understood something about the boundary between life and death that we've yet to grasp. Perhaps she discovered that this boundary is not a wall, but a membrane, something that can be manipulated, thinned, even opened, if you know the right method. Perhaps the house was never meant to be understood by the living, but by those who exist in the spaces between. On rainy nights, when you hear unexplained sounds in old houses, when floorboards creak with weight that isn't there, when you feel the certainty of a presence in rooms you know are empty, consider this. Perhaps it's not the storm you're hearing, but the restless dead, still seeking the shelter she promised them. Perhaps Sarah Winchester's invitation, extended so many years ago, still echoes through the veil. Perhaps the house she built still calls to those who wander, offering sanctuary or imprisonment, refuge or trap. The mystery endures. The questions multiply, and the rain continues to fall on the Winchester Mystery House, drumming on roofs that shouldn't echo quite the way they do, running down walls that hide secrets we may never uncover, filling the air with sounds that might be water or might be something else entirely, something that has been waiting a very long time to be heard. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.